and I'd like to welcome you to the BC Library Association's Summer Conference. This session is part of the 2020 virtual webinar series titled The Conversation Continues. BCLA is privileged to be presenting the 2020 Summer Conference from the city of Vancouver. And Vancouver is located on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. BCLA had an amazing program of speakers lined up for the 2020 annual in-person conference this year. And when we couldn't go ahead with that conference, we asked presenters if they would share virtually some of the fantastic ideas that they had worked on and prepared for the in-person conference. This was an opportunity for BCLA to join with presenters and help contribute to the professional learning of the library community. So thank you to all the presenters who were able to commit the time and effort to transforming their presentations into an online format. Today's session is the first session we have recorded live with an audience. We hope that the technical aspect of the session goes smoothly, but please bear with us if there is a challenge or two. Because the session is being recorded and will be available through the BCLA website, we want to remind you that questions or comments should be in the chat window, and that when you do use the window, you should select all attendees. And when you do that, those questions will be captured on the recording. Now, if you have a technical question, please, it's not necessary to share with everyone that's attending today. Just use the chat, but select panelists only. And then one of our staff will be able to get back to you and help in some way. When there are questions for today's presenters, please add your question to the chat and then select for all panelists and presenters. This way, everyone, including the panelists, will see your presentation or will see your question. So let me now welcome Emily Sugerman, who will be introducing and moderating today's panel. Welcome, Emily, and let me turn today's session over to you. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you, Annette, and I would like to introduce today's excellent panel members. Mei Chan is currently Head Metadata Services for University of Toronto Libraries. She was previously Cataloging Manager for Burnaby Public Library and began her career at Vancouver Public Library. Her 17 years of experience in public libraries have instilled a strong value for service excellence and collaboration. Mei is a member of the joint Canada, US, and UK Cataloging Ethics Steering Committee, serving as a representative for CFLA, FCAB's Cataloging and Metadata Standards Committee. She was the steering committee's liaison for the Access Scope and Infrastructure Working Group. And Maryann Kempthorne is the Manager of Innovation and Learning for North Vancouver District Library. Bringing a background in academic, public, school, and special libraries, as well as cultural enterprises and open access software, she is a keen presenter on library work and especially cataloging. With a long-standing commitment to library education and professionalism of libraries, museums, and archives, Maryann volunteers in the area of continuing education, writes about libraries and library process widely on social media, is dedicated to convening community conversations, and has taught cataloging and classification topics since 2003. And Antonio Muñoz Gómez is a cataloging and metadata librarian at the University of Waterloo. He has previously worked in cataloging and metadata positions at the University of Toronto, and until most recently at the University of Northern British Columbia. where he was also liaison for the Anthropology, History, and First Nations Studies departments. And we have a special time for credits at the conclusion of our talk, but at this time I would also like to acknowledge two important members of our panel who could not be here today. Thank you to Richard Violette of Special Libraries Cataloging and chair of the Cataloging and Technical Services Interest Group, also known as BC CATS, of BCLA, for his invaluable advice, insights, and encouragement. And thank you to Samantha Bloomfield, Surrey Schools Learning Resources Services and Secretary of BC CATS, for her involvement with the panel as well. So thank you to Richard and Samantha, and welcome May, Maryann, and Antonio.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. Hopefully everybody can hear us on the line. So yes, I was one of the founding panelists with this proposal, and we wrote in with a number of discussion questions I think we'll be delivering on today.
Yes, and this is just our agenda. For the first part of our session today, panelists will be engaging in an informal Q&A with each other in response to questions that highlight our theme of cataloging as a political process. And following that, May will provide some updates from the Cataloging Ethics Steering Committee. And then at the conclusion, we will be taking questions from the audience through the chat feature on Zoom, as Annette mentioned. So let's get started. So first question, has systemic change brought beneficial changes to cataloging and other technical services processes since the turn of the century? Maryann?
So I was a little bit biased maybe in coming up with this question, since I am a librarian since the turn of the century. But I worked also in the last century. I'm going to work almost exactly half my career in the old century and half my career in this one. I'm very dedicated to cataloging and technical services work, and I do also teach in this area. I find when it comes to the changes that have happened in the 21st century, I have so much work to do with teaching around what happened in the 19th century or the 20th century, when really cataloging development was designed around the thinking and ideas of big leaders in the 19th century, and then disseminated through cooperative work in the 20th century and through publishing on the old Anglo-American network. Whereas since the turn of the century, we've seen a lot of disruption there around cataloging codes that we would think come close to kind of creating a neutral balance inside cataloging process. But then right at the turn of the century, with the explosion of electronic resources, we got this enormous mixer that I think has caused a lot of change. Some of it has been beneficial. I think especially the changes that we see for format. I mean, look at what we're doing today, in that libraries have become carriers of digital content. That was a big disruptive change in our technical services process that has large benefits. But also when that occurred, we had publishers and platform developers all of a sudden come into our space and stand between us in the collection management steps with our patrons. And we really didn't necessarily have the ability to both add digital collections and build a lot of technical service process for that workflow. Of course, when people think about changes in cataloging since 2000, 2001, we think of RDA, we think about metadata model changes. Those, I think, are indisputably beneficial. We have actually washed our hands of the old Anglo-American network, where cataloging process was so tied to language and so tied to just those communities. And now we have RDA standards that are flexible, that can fold in more local practice, that can actually participate in global citizenship and accommodate multilingualism in a way that I don't think we were going to do in the old AACR R2 kind of versions. I think local practice to manage data really took over since the turn of the century, and that's been a plus and a minus. not having consistency, not having the ability to develop workforces or educate them at universities in a single standard is, and set of ethics is a bit challenging. And then lastly, I'm largely a systems librarian, and the change that we really hoped we'd benefit from was to be able to take the capacity it took for us to run our old ILSs and move it around the organization. And here it is 2020, and I'm still spending many, many hours in my day servicing those old ILSs. And we have wonderful new metadata models. We have very talented catalogers creating new systems, but we never had anybody show up from software land and say, oh, we'll find a way to create really great infrastructure for you around your patron library relationship. So we're going to find somebody to really, visualize your beautiful subject heading data. That work is still to be done. And I think it will be beneficial when it comes, but we have a real hodgepodge right now of kind of pros and cons in the way we've navigated change, I think.
I think that one of the things that I like about this question is that it positions cataloging as an activity that happens socially, but also temporary dimension. So, and what I mean by this is not just the idea of the turn of the century, but even if we think about cataloging within the timeline of library work. So if I were to use kind of like a buzzword these days in the news of supply chain, the supply chain of catalogers. And I'm, of course, going to oversimplify it, but if we think about what Maryann was saying about publishing, so in the context of an academic library, there would be some publishers who would decide what gets to make it out there into the information universe. And then second to that, there would be a librarian who would be deciding what to purchase from that information universe. And that is often limited by budget, by physical space, by different considerations of that kind. And then eventually the book arrives in the library and the cataloger starts processing and doing the work that we do. And it really strikes me as an attempt to extrapolate standard rules and things that apply to the entire universe of information based off on a very, very reduced amount of items that we have in front of us. And I think that if we think in terms of the way historically the conversation has been happening in academic contexts, we can see that increasingly there are more and more voices that are being heard, that are becoming part of the published and unpublished or even great literature type of things. And with that, what I think is that the nature of the collection development process is changing, and that in turn impacts the work that we are doing in cataloging. If we think about concepts like literary warrant, it's not the same literary warrant that you would have for, say, certain topics nowadays than previously, when it was primarily, a certain type of demographic that was putting out everything. So I think that that's kind of one important thing. And I want to be mindful of time, but if I have time, later I may come back to some technical aspects of this question that are also interesting, but I want to give May some time to speak if she has also something to say.
Yeah, I have maybe a few thoughts here. I approached this question like writing an essay. So I had a lot of questions about the question. So, some pointers for myself and then to ask aloud for the group here is, what kind of systemic change are we talking about? And who are the drivers of this systemic change? What are we changing from to? So some of the forces that I thought were worth remarking on here is just this kind of like what has happened since the Industrial Revolution. So, industrialization, globalization, and then an extension of that, technological advancements. I think all those forces has pushed cataloging into this sort of like talking about it in terms of production. So, in all the environments I've worked at, there's, we keep rigorous statistics on how much we produced. Yeah, there's a count of how many we do original and copy and all that. So is that a benefit? I feel that I guess with some of these things that have happened, there are ways that we can do our work more efficiently and produce sort of higher volume. But at the same time, it's not true, like as Maryann points out, you know, the publishing industry, new scholarly outputs or just new outputs of knowledge, digital formats. I mean, that has really increased the volume in such a way where even with new advances in technology, it's really hard to keep up. So on the one hand, we have maybe had more efficient process. On the other hand, we're also not coping with the volume. So I just wanted to provide a nuance kind of comment on that. But, you know, at the same time, I think where it all started is then, you know, I think back in the days when we were producing cards for the catalogs, you know, folks then had in mind how to make cards efficiently to distribute. And so, you know, that idea of having standards, I think has been very good for our area of work, to the point when I'm just learning, University of Toronto Libraries is moving to a new platform. So there's many different kinds of data in our, you know, in the library services platform, you know, circulation, acquisitions, cataloging. Well, the cataloging data was the easiest to move over, right? Because of these standards. So I would say some of these systemic things have happened, which has led us to value standards is a good thing. At the same time, standards are also biased, and they can lead to excluding certain groups, or they have their limitations as well. Another systemic change thing is around technology is just, you know, the move to the internet. That was a big deal. The benefits there is that it actually allows catalogers to collaborate more easily. So I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, the internet was also the thing that made us wonder if cataloging was relevant anymore, because we could do things we could search things by keyword back in the day. So that was, you know, 20 plus years ago. And I don't know, I mean, I kind of like have this like secret like laugh to myself to say that, you know, now we're kind of like leveled up in our use of the internet. And it's just clear to me all the more that structured data is a really, really important thing as we prepare for the semantic web or realize what linked data looks like. So I feel that there are challenges and opportunities that are brought with these kinds of systemic changes. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think you all touched on systemic and technological change, and also that collaborative aspect that you brought up at the end there, May. I think that's maybe a good segue to the next question that we have, which is, now that direct access to communities and how they form meaning to their metadata is possible, is domain knowledge required inside of the cataloging process? Antonio, did you want to take that one?
Sure. One of the things that I would start is remarking the word now, because I don't necessarily think that this is something exclusive to now. And I think that some form of domain knowledge in cataloging has always existed. And one of the easiest examples I can think of is when it comes to language cataloging. There was specialized knowledge in terms of being able to catalog materials that were in languages other than English. And usually that knowledge of language came together with either a credential of study in a particular, area of the world, or from personal knowledge of the particular cultures that the person was cataloging, because it was his or her first language. So that has always existed in some form or shape, and I think that there has also always been some sort of access to the community in terms of knowing how to represent and create meaning from their metadata. For example, if we think about name authority records, and we look at the 670s of many of those records, we will sometimes find like conversation with the author said that the preferred form was this or clarified that. So I think that access existed before. I think that maybe like this idea of direct access is also not necessarily something new. I think that for example, in smaller libraries or specialized libraries, I think that they have had a huge amount of experience in this for many years before now. And just to provide an example, if we think about something like Maryann classification, like that came from direct knowledge and contact with the community, and it happened way before truth and reconciliation was something that people in libraries were talking about more broadly. Those small libraries had access to those communities. So I think that domain knowledge has existed for a while now. I think that some of the changes and some of the differences and nuances is that there are now different ways for the community to interact with the metadata. For example, in terms of consumption, they are not just getting this metadata from the catalog, they are getting it from Google, they are getting it from other places. And then they can compare and see which metadata they prefer and how they use it. But it's also in terms of creation of metadata, because there are different communities of practice that are experienced in and experts in their particular fields. And it can be from something very, sophisticated to something as silly as Pokemon communities that catalog and classify every single Pokemon there is, and they have like very sophisticated metadata to those things. And so I think that the challenge in cataloging is to try to make sense of like that whole vast array of metadata places and try to standardize it in a meaningful way. One of the things that I constantly think about in terms of metadata is we are always told metadata is data about data. And when I think about cataloging metadata in particular, I think that it is context about data, because it's not just data out there in the, in the bushes. It's data that pertains to a collection that has been curated for a particular community with specific needs. So that knowledge is there. And I think that the other change that's kind of important in terms of communication and access with the community is the expectation that the work that we are doing is no longer limited to standardization and disambiguation, but it goes beyond that into considering ethical aspects of how the terminology that we choose is going to be used, how certain, dates of birth or gender identification in a name authority record, how is that going to impact the individual or the community that we are describing? So I think that those are some of the questions that are starting to become more visible, but I think that it has always existed in some form or shape.
I just am so excited about you making that clarification that it's always been there. I think that we are talking about those things like getting sucked into the discussion of how we produce things. And I just love what you said when you said, we got to get past that label. Metadata is data about data. It's true. When we talk about catalog data, what is it you said, Antonio? The context in metadata. That is so correct and so useful and usable, I think. When this question was written, I think we were thinking more in terms of read-write web technology. So just one little push further on the question or answer or thinking and commentary we'd love to hear in this webinar from people out there watching, as well as, taxonomies. Those are pieces that require trust. I used to work at the Museum of Anthropology. I was working in that area of Aboriginal Information Services when the National Library of Australia was funding local subject work by local communities to identify themselves. Is that the kind of modular approach you want to go in new areas? And the ethics committee I was working with, we were looking at the brilliant work the zine community does for their cataloging. And those things are really strong folksonomies. Those are really, you know, supporting still domain knowledge at the chair of the cataloger, yes, but also engaging, like you said, with how the community chooses to name itself. Very easy in new areas to the catalog, easier in new formats, incredibly challenging in Canada. I even think if we ever had to follow through on those big naming projects, that libraries have to think about the density of local naming work that needs to go there. But yeah, there's a lot around trust for how people could not just be consuming good catalog data, but contributing it. So much promise there. May, I'm sure you have something to add on this question, do you?
Yeah, well, I was really challenged by this question as well, and I've and I think what I have to say builds on what you have both offered. I was thinking that there's two ways to look at domain knowledge here. There's the domain knowledge of the community, and then there's the domain knowledge of librarianship, and within that domain, the knowledge of catalogers. And I was a bit uncomfortable with the question because it could be framed in to lead us to think of an either-or situation, and I'm more inclined to take up both and. I think catalogers have a great deal of skill and knowledge to impart to local communities in their efforts to describe and organize information. And conversely, we, and by extension, all library kind of and information professionals need to respect through learning the domain knowledge of the communities that we serve. And I was really struck by this question because I think if I stayed in public libraries, this would have been a much harder question for me to answer because my job wouldn't have had natural connections to the community. But in my current job, I'm constantly asked by others around best practices around structured data. And even prior to my taking this job, the name of the department was renamed from cataloging to and metadata services just to simply metadata services. And the vision of that, of I think the name change had to do with not just only creating metadata or maintaining it, but teaching other people, teaching local communities on how to structure their data. And so, you know, a very big thing in academic circles right now is research data management and digital scholarship and humanities. And there's a lot of interest in data science and figuring out how to capture their research data in ways that they can share and all that. And so I find it very fascinating that the library has thought of the cataloging department as a source of domain knowledge. But that requires then like us to learn about what the user wants. So I think I want to maybe just give a tip for people to follow here. University of Calgary has been granted a Mellon grant around this, where their metadata services unit, I think they renamed it that way, or something similar, to actually teach graduate students on how to describe their research data. I thought that was wonderful.
Okay, wow, thank you. That was a very rich response, I think. Just being mindful of the time, it's 2:30 now already. So I can, maybe we can hit the third question with brief responses from everyone, or a question of your choosing, and then go into some Q&A from the audience. And also just wanted to remind the audience that anytime you hear something that strikes a chord with you based on what Antonio, May, or Maryann has said, please feel free to write a comment or a question in the chat box. I'm going to be monitoring it as we proceed. So checking in with everyone, should we approach one of our final questions here in a brief round before heading to questions?
I can do a 1-minute question.
All right, let's go. Which one were you thinking?
Number 3 in 1 minute.
Okay, sweet. Okay, all right.
thank you sincerely to BCLA for inviting conference proposals this year on democracy, right? Like we were really, I think at BC Cat, so excited to talk about the democratic role of libraries from a cataloger's lens. And really, I'm not going to belabor this, but I mean, we catalog a lot of different materials in libraries, and we do it for so many different individuals, people who are facing issues of language right, accessibility, people who have disabilities are entitled to access to materials they can't afford or otherwise get. We meet the legal needs that people have to be empowered democratic citizens. And it's just a really exciting part of library service, whether it's academic or public or special library, the social justice cataloging work going on out there in every format, photo collections that reveal wonderful things about society and the richness of the human experience, especially in British Columbia. I just really want to send a huge shout out to libraries, big and small, that do this work. I think that catalogers do think about adding access and creating great connections between every, well, the Raghunathan law, right? Every book, its reader, and having an extensive interaction with access. I've worked with amazing people in technical services who do that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Maryann. Just monitoring the chat here. We have a question from Andrea who asks, what is the best way to identify who is erased or invisible in traditional structured metadata?
Well, I would say, you know, use the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Like, we need to think in those frames. There's still huge potholes and chasms in our collections in the explosion of formats. To have catalog records that are complete. That's one tool I use.
If I am understanding the question correctly, one easy way to see what's left out of your catalog is to run some kind of report on the topics that you're interested in. So for example, if there's a particular collection area that you want to know, just run a report and see what's there. And once you know what you have a lot of, you can see how is it described? Does the description fit like what's going on right now? What doesn't seem to be present? And I think that it's not like a very clear answer, because I don't think that it's possible to do it for all the different disciplines and topics that the catalog may have. But if you start by looking and counting the things that you have in your catalog and seeing like how many in this call number range, how many with this subject heading, and that's kind of like an approach to start and looking. And that goes back to what I was saying about context. It will be very different for each library, because if your library is specialized in medicine, you may have a lot of books on medicine, but that doesn't mean that you're leaving out a lot of voices. It just means your library specializes in that. But if you're more broad in your collection, then I would start with just a simple report on the topics that you think might be underrepresented.
Yeah, and to build on that, my first thought wasn't to think about what about the metadata. My first thought was about the collection. So because metadata, well, like library metadata serves the collection. And so if something happened to the collection, if something got removed from the collection, by extension, the metadata typically goes with it. And I would say then it's dependent on the library, whether how transparent they are about documenting decisions about what they choose to withdraw, and how people collaborate on this. Did something get withdrawn in consultation with peers, or was this, you know, something that somebody just thought it was not great and decided, you know? So that's kind of interesting, because I just don't think of it only limited in terms of metadata. Catalogers don't tend to delete things like on their own in isolation. It's always connected to a larger library process.
Okay. We have a question from Meg asking, do you feel that it is hard to have subject headings that reflect current terms as they flow and evolve so rapidly?
Yes, language is an organic thing, and standards development is, depending on the community that you're in, isn't as organic. Hard does not mean you don't try or we don't try. And it kind of depends on the network and the technology you're working with. So this is one of the promises of linked data. So we're talking about systemic change earlier, moving to like the web, internet, linked data, that sort of thing. That platform offers a lot of flexibility in creating new taxonomies, using new vocabularies to do what you need it to do. So it's hard. So you go with the best tool you can at the time, try to find stakeholders or collaborators and do it and see where that takes you. The tricky thing about that, it is maintenance. Maintenance and what's the plan to carry that forward. So that's a resourcing challenge.
How does Wikipedia do that? It is really what I was kind of trying to hint at earlier about the missing link with us still living inside our ILSs, and that the mental and personal commitment to innovating and iterating how we think about library data, I think is stronger than the tools at hand, if you know what I'm saying. Linked data and being able to use resource identifiers that would free us from having the text strings of subject headings be the meaning. We just really are in such a rush for that since '97. Just saying.
One thing that I just wanted to quickly try and summarize when I was thinking about this question and relating it back to whose voices are being left out. May and I don't know very well Maryann, like we're coming from institutions with good budgets for systems and these kinds of things. We have like academic libraries and budgets and staff and whatnot, but there are many libraries out there that don't necessarily have access to the same tools for doing their cataloging work. So I was in a conference in Mexico last year where one of the presentations, they had done a survey of all the libraries in public libraries, that is in Mexico, that didn't have access to an OPAC. And it was like only a very tiny number of libraries. I cannot remember the exact numbers, but it was like surprising how few libraries in Mexico had an OPAC, which for a lot of us is like something very simple, something very obvious. But on the other hand, like because they don't have access to this technology, because they are not having to wrestle their heads around like Library of Congress and things like that, it gave them a lot of flexibility. So they could create their own subject and terminology and things like that. And they were very creative in the way that they approach these things. And there was another presentation in that conference about somebody trained people from an indigenous community on how to do cataloging, but they said like, okay, this is the theory of what elements need to be captured. How you capture them or that's up to you, and here's the infrastructure that you would need. So yeah, I think that we need to remember that not all libraries are at the same level as every other library, not just in Canada, but in the world.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. We have another question as well. I'll just read it out. The question is, thinking back to the topic of direct access to communities and domain knowledge, what lessons can catalogers and metadata specialists take away from user tagging systems? What can be done to better integrate user terms while still ensuring data remains structured and vocabulary retains some level of control?
I have a lot of thoughts on this. Antonio, you go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that I don't know that it necessarily has to be an either or, and it can depend on what the end user is looking for in the metadata. And I know that some systems allow for social tagging to coexist with, you know, structured subject headings and things like that. So I don't know, I haven't really seen any practical applications of this, but I know that the technology is there that allows for a library catalog to accommodate both. And I think that in some ways it might be useful for the end user if that's the way that they are navigating the information. But at the same time, there's policies that have to be developed. What happens if a user willingly creates something that's offensive or abusive? Like, how do you monitor for that kind of thing? So I don't know that answers the question, but it's
One thing I say about this work too is to maybe think outside library land. Like we have kept our own house, and it's a good time now to look for lessons around user tagging systems from systems that are not library, and then try to see if we can run some parallel systems there for a soon to come join. If you think about in the public library space, the failure of user tagging in the BiblioCommons interface, we have a lot of opportunity to reflect and see where that technology was maybe a little too soon. And we built it just for ourselves. And the less we get unbound from the old systems that we have that were so in keeping with, like I mentioned, that Anglo-American network and that older generation. You know, retrospective conversion work is really hard to bear in mind. I think being opportunistic is a great way to have success with user tagging and those sorts of things. Go to something new and try to make a join and a little progress.
Yeah, my response to this question was very mixed, and it was a range of emotions that went in through me. I will disclose, I'm not a big fan of user tagging systems. This is coming from the lens of like the cataloger, right? The domain expertise, because you know, invariably these things are, because they're so organic, they just don't live on. It's a lot of maintenance. Having said that, I think I could be objective if I took a step back to say what I could learn from that is that people want to name things. People want to catalog things on their own terms, which is totally fine. And so I think we need to remember that. And what I'm intrigued by about the question here is, then for me, if I see how users are tagging things and I want to have a conversation with them. So if I'm seeing terms breed like rabbits, I'd like to be involved with, you know, helping training or having a conversation with the community. Say, what are your needs? Let's see if there's something we can do to get what you want. And here's a little bit of science. Here's a little bit of data science behind this, right? And then, you know, leave it up to that group to decide what they find valuable. Yeah, I think just the reality that if you want something, you know, if you want something, or you want to be able to retrieve something reliably, you do need control. And I think controlled vocabulary is one of those things that's not natural to how we do things. We want to name things, but we don't think about how to do that consistently because I can't remember the word I used yesterday. That's just not how the brain works. So those are some initial thoughts. Antonio, were you going to say something?
I was just like wondering as you were talking, like if this would be one of the ways to figure out which voices are being left out, because I would imagine that if you turned on a feature like social tagging, the people who feel less represented are the more likely to start tagging things that talk about them. So I don't know, as an experiment, it might work if somebody wants to try it and report back on their findings.
It does raise new audiences. I did a very large photograph collection, 7,000 photographs in a small community that had largely a borrower population of book readers. And all of a sudden, I got all of this user input on automotive history because there were so many pictures of cars and we couldn't get any of the metadata correct. We didn't know what we were doing. And then we had people really wanted to contribute to the conversation. It was something we hadn't even thought of. I just was looking back at original notes too and talking about access and communities. The other voice that does get left out is not necessarily what I mentioned before, which is kind of social groupings, but also economic differences. So libraries are still largely, and their metadata is largely dominated by published works. And open access publishing is happening in a different place. It is happening out there on the web. It is being successful with uncontrolled vocabularies in a lot of cases. So let's just bring that group into the conversation a little bit briefly too. I just was hopeful of that.
All right, we had another update that May was gonna dive into just about the cataloging ethics work. Thank you everyone for responding to these questions from the chat. Just being mindful of the time, we're gonna switch gears into the sort of second portion of the talk that we had planned to illustrate for you today. So I'm going to get that ready here. So yeah, May, did you have some updates here?
Yeah, I just wanted to give an update that the Cataloging Ethics Steering Committee is imminently about to launch a draft of some principles, some guidelines on how to approach resource description with ethics in mind. This is work that started about a year ago, and I wanted to give a shout out to BC participants when we issued a call for volunteers to work on the working groups to inform the steering committee's work. Quite a number of participants came from the BC community, and I was really, really pleased to see that. So as a result of that, the working groups completed their work last fall. Their reports have informed the steering committee to their process to draft some principles. This is a living document, intended to be a living document. This is a collaboration among the UK, among CILIP, ALA, and CFLA, FCAB. So this is a serious commitment to address all these things that people are raising, and all that that is kind of contained in these questions. So I just wanted to draw attention to the website if you wanted to see the sort of the work that's been done so far. More currently on June the 10th, and I don't know what it is in BC time, but on June the 10th, there is an event, a ALA event, to talk about the process, and I believe we're going to be revealing the draft principles for input, so that it will go to public consultation. So so that's CST, is that 10 a.m. in BC? Yeah, so anyway, hold the date. We even the steering committee themselves, we don't know what platform we're using, but if you're interested in hearing more and from a more like a broader perspective, then please do hold the date.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, May. Okay, so we have oh, we've done this. We've gone into some questions from the audience. I'm just going to thank everyone for taking the time to be here and be engaged with us as we have this conversation. And does anyone have any concluding remarks that they want to say before we just go to the last slide here?
I did want to encourage people as well to try to participate in the work of the Ethics Committee. We are talking about a wide array of technical services and input. Lots of professions have codes that they follow of ethics in their operation. And it's a really exciting opportunity for us to get community voice. So remember, as a community of librarians, you have voice as well. So please take the opportunity to join. We talked about access and infrastructure, owned, open access or proprietary systems. If you have anything to contribute around taxonomies, community language, the operations of classifications, the website is very good to give you a little bit more about that. And I think as panelists, none of us would be shy if anyone wanted to reach out and ask us a little bit more about that work. Ethics is very closely tied to your education, access to mentors and coaching. And talk to your bosses, please, and your teachers. And let's continue to develop this conversation outside of BCLA. It's been really great to be welcomed at BCLA on the topic. That was all I had for today.
Yeah. I have something to add to this, and I'm looking at the attendees list just to kind of get a range of, get a sense of who the participants are. I can see a lot of technical services colleagues on the call. And so my thoughts here are to encourage technical services colleagues, but also folks working with technical services to work with each other on this. So, you know, this idea about cataloging and ethics and whether, you know, cataloging work is neutral or not, this is one part of the whole workflow or one part of the whole service of library service. And so one of the things that I feel, I guess, quite strongly about is like catalogers I would say, depending on the circle you're in, could be unfairly cornered into solving this problem on their own. It's so easy to say, oh, those catalogers using this pejorative term, and you know, it's not as simple as the catalogers using this. I think those of us who are in public or services or reference or instruction, any of that, work with your cataloger. Or if you're an administrator, even better, give them some money and resources to participate in collaborative efforts, like at the PCC level, to be sitting on these committees at the national level. So all that takes time to change, right? Like social things take time to change, and it takes energy. And so, you know, like I guess I just don't want catalogers to receive a mixed message to say, oh, we need to pump out 50,000 records a year, and have someone complain about this pejorative term and not give them time to work on it. So I guess I wanted to just highlight the collaborative nature of social change here.
And in terms of concluding remarks, I don't really have any other than thanking you for inviting me to participate. Thank you, May and Maryann, for your very insightful comments. And thank you, Emily, for sharing the panel.
You're very welcome. Thank you, everyone, as well for being here. And we have just a final credit slide just to again acknowledge the support of Samantha and Richard, who have assisted us with the preparation of this talk today as well, and provided valuable input. Thanks again for the audience as well for joining, and I think I'll turn it over to Annette.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, May. Thank you, Antonio and Maryann, for passionate and really informative contribution to the BC Summer Library Conference. To all of you that are in the audience, thank you for being here today. And for those of you that would like to see the full program for our summer conference, please visit the BCLA website. It's www.bclaconnect.ca. And thank you all again for joining. I hope we hear from all of you soon. The work is fantastic. So from all of us in the audience, thank you very much to today's presenters.
Thank you for having us.
Our pleasure.